Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. Is the two-state solution in the Middle East doomed to failure? A number of people in the region think so, and many are now mulling a one-state alternative as the impasse between the Palestinians and the Israelis continues. The Palestinian Authority rejected Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's offer to freeze settlement construction if the PLO recognizes Israel as a Jewish state. There are now some 500,000 Israelis living on occupied Palestinian land. Critics say Israel's continuing encroachment jeopardizes a two-state solution since it makes a future border harder to draw. So today we ask, is it time for the Palestinians and the Israelis to consider a one-state alternative? A reminder that you can call in with your questions and comments, and we of course welcome your SMS and emails on the show. Joining me now from Boston is Professor Layla Farsak of the University of Massachusetts. She argues that Palestinians are already living in a single state, an apartheid Israeli state. And with me in the studio is Hussein Ibish of the American Task Force on Palestine, a Washington, D.C. based group dedicated to a peaceful two-state solution. Welcome to both of you to the show.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Professor Farsak, I want to start with you. You believe the two-state solution is dead. Why do you believe that?
Well, because all the facts on the ground reveal that the two-state solution is dead. We have over 200 settlements. As you just noted, there are 500,000 Israelis living in the West Bank and Gaza, in the West Bank in the settlements. The West Bank is cut by over 99 permanent checkpoints, and on and off it has something of the order of 400 temporary checkpoints. So people's mobility within the West Bank is constrained by these Israeli checkpoints, which became now full-fledged terminals, which cut the West Bank into more or less 10 to 12 self-enclosed or encircled, what I call Bantustans, because the Palestinians who are living in Nablus or living in Ramallah or living in Hebron cannot get to each other's places without passing through these checkpoints, which can be quite cumbersome and increase the transaction costs immensely. And they are also at the mercy of the Israelis removing these checkpoints. So from a territorial point of view, the Palestinians do not have a contiguous state within the West Bank, let alone being connected to the Gaza Strip. And also economically, they are fully at the mercy of Israeli closure and checkpoint policy. And politically, the attainment of Palestinian autonomy has been very important but limiting insofar as the Palestinians cannot on the ground have a viable state, all the more that Israel continues to control Area C, which is up to 59% of the West Bank.
Okay, Hussein Ibish, those are pretty compelling reasons.
Yeah, all of that is true, and none of it is dispositive about the creation of two states. All it tells us is the difficulties facing a two-state solution, and I've never denied those, and I don't downplay them. All of that is true. It does assume, of course, that everything that exists now is an immutable, permanent political fact, whereas in fact I would point out that settlements can be put in and they can be taken out. Walls can be put up and taken out. Now the point is there is no alternative to a two-state agreement in practice except continued occupation and conflict. Israel doesn't have another plan for what to do with 5 million or 4.5 million Palestinians other than a viable Palestinian state or continued occupation and conflict. So it's in the interests of all parties. Does that mean they will necessarily do it? No, of course, they might be irrational. People can be irrational and do things that are very much against their interests. But I have to say, I don't see there's any way of getting to a single democratic state. It seems to me completely off the table. There are many fanciful options that people put forward that sound good, but if you look at the array of forces, social, political, economic, and military, they can't produce these fanciful outcomes. They can produce continued occupation and conflict, and they could produce a two-state solution. I think it's going to be very hard to get it, but I think those are the only two options. Everything else is just imaginative, in my view.
Professor Farsak?
Well, I wish to disagree. I totally agree with Hussein that the problem is today that we don't have the political constituency for a one-state solution. And I think most activists and thinkers of the one-state are well aware that the one-state is solution is not going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It's a long-term political project. However, what I do think that we are all in the impasse, and we see it today with the stallment on the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, is that Israel has not been and continues not to be really interested in a two-state solution. What is really interested in is giving the Palestinians a Bantustan and calling it a state. And that's the danger that we are caught up in now with the two-state solution. For I think most Palestinians want a two-state solution. They want independence from the Israelis. They fought for independence from the Israelis. The peace process, the Oslo peace process, was based on this principle that we are going to get a Palestinian state, and that was the historical compromise that we took in order to have the state. But after 18 years of peace process, where what we've seen is more and more encroachment on Palestinian lands, and more dangerously, more and more fragmentation and Bantustanization. I really insist on the word Bantustanization because people forget that the South African example had a very similar structure. They were given Bantustans, which were autonomies, where Palestinian and where the blacks in South Africa had control over a little bit of their land, had control over their economic resources, had control over their economic and social life. And the South African government were willing to declare these Bantustans actually states. The difference was that in South Africa, when these Bantustans created in '59 declared independence in 1974, first with the Transkei, were never acknowledged internationally as such. In the Palestinian context, the difficulty we have is that in the international consensus and our historical compromise has been based on the fact that we accepted the partition plan, we accepted the two-state solution, and we want the two-state solution. The problem is that Israel is not interested and has proven capable of bypassing this option, and actually with an international approval, more or less. That today we're no longer discussing whether the settlements are illegal or are legal, but rather we're discussing whether Israel was going to put a moratorium on settlements expansion, which just shows you how much the discourse has shifted to a situation whereby we're legitimizing or accepting the presence of the settlements and of the wall that compromises on the viability and the possibility of a Palestinian state.
I agree.
Hussein a chance to respond to
I
that.
agree very strongly with all of those cautionary words. And as I say, I don't downplay the difficulties, but no Palestinian leadership is going to accept anything less than full sovereignty and independence, and neither should they. The situation we have now is not a permanent situation. It cannot be made a permanent situation. You can't have a modified occupation. That's not going to be acceptable. So I think we all agree on that. The question is it in any way an attractive alternative strategy to say we have an idea that very few people buy into, either among Israelis or Palestinians, that we can't really define, that we have no strategy of achieving, that for which there isn't a clear scenario for getting there. What we're going to do is we're going to dump a scenario that is possible, although it's difficult, which is a two-state solution. And you do have, some very important changes that sort of suggest that a two-state solution is actually still viable, not least its continuing increasing importance to the United States and the fact that it's become now a national security priority for the Obama administration, and the lack of alternatives for Israel, and the growing international consensus, not just about the desirability, but the urgency for this, So I would say asking people to ditch a strategy that's going to be difficult but might work for something that might transpire over the next 60 or 70 years, maybe, if even, is not a very attractive alternative.
Well, let me get some clarity from the professor. Well, Professor, let me ask you this. How would a one-state solution work? Would it effectively be an apartheid state? How would minority rights be protected? And given current demographic trends, at some point in the future, we're going to have an Arab majority, aren't we?
Of course, we're going to have an Arab majority, but I think that's what's also giving the impetus for the one-state idea. I mean, I don't think that the options here are whether you are going to ditch a workable solution, which is the two-state solution, and whether you're being idealistic and utopian and unrealistic about another solution which could happen in 60 years down the road. I don't think that the conflict is today being posed in that way, although Israel is posing it in that way, or the international consensus is dealing with it for the time being as such. I think rather the problem is that given the demographic reality of the Palestinian, given the fact that in the land between the river and the sea today we have around 6 million Jews and around similarly 5.8 million Palestinians, if you count the Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, you're having a demographic reality that over the next 20 years will become actually more than just a majority. And that's with people who don't have political rights or limited political rights for the Israelis and the autonomy.
This is a recipe for conflict. I mean, this is what you've described as a recipe for conflict, but not a recipe for harmony.
But it is not. Yeah, okay, but the problem is that we are in a conflict, and what we're saying is that we need to define this conflict by what it is today, rather than what we would like it to be. We would like it to be a conflict today of an occupation that can be removed, whereas I think what has happened over the past 40 years is that the occupation has become a structural apartheid, and it needs to be called as an apartheid in order to combat it. And I think that's the strategy that the one-staters are trying to argue, although not all of them are in that line, is that you need to define the conflict within its apartheid structure in order to combat it. And there where comes the hope that combating apartheid, the best way to combat apartheid is through, is through a one-state solution.
All right, in fact, okay, go ahead.
Thanks. Just very briefly.
Yeah, but just one.
Well, hold on. No, I've been asked to speak. No, I mean, look, I would agree with the idea that you have a single state right now, and that in the occupied territories it looks a lot like apartheid. And so what I would say to people is, this is really what it looks like. And I don't see any. The revolutionary change is not some kind of gradual reform from within, for which there is no process, because the Palestinians are not citizens, and the Israelis are not going to let them become citizens, and they have a very powerful state. The real revolutionary change is to force an end to the occupation. I think still the visionary thing is Palestinian independence. It's a question of whether we think it's possible or not. I think it still is, and I'm really not persuaded at all that there's any way of getting to a single state, because among other things, there's a very robust debate among Palestinians, and it's not between one-staters and two-staters, it's between nationalists and Islamists. There's no major political faction among Palestinians that's interested in this, and none at all in Israel, where they're arguing between the center-right and the right.
Okay,
so until this becomes part of the actual political debate, it's really just an academic exercise.
Okay, we will continue our debate in just a moment. We have to take a short break right now. We'll have more of our discussion in a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Efforts to find a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem have been littered with failures. So is it time to consider the alternative, a single Israeli state where Palestinians and Israelis live together? Joining us to discuss this are Professor Leila Farsak, who teaches political science at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and with me in the studio, Hussein Ibish of the Hala Salam Maqsood Foundation for Arab American Leadership. Thanks again to both of you for joining us. I want to go straight to the phones. Omar has been waiting to talk to us. He's in Ohio. Omar, go ahead.
Yes, sir. With me watching all this two-state solution and one-state solution, I think we should just go by like a Commonwealth, you know, like they did with Puerto Rico, and be a part of the United States, since Israel is a big ally to the United States, and the Palestinians will become a big ally to the Palestinian state. So let's just have one state. Every 4 years we'll have an election. Maybe a Jew will be a president, maybe a Palestinian will be a president, and that's the end of that. Otherwise, we have to end up negotiating for another 20 years.
Okay, thanks, Omar. Let me put that to Hussein Ibish.
I just don't believe that anything but a tiny minority of Israelis would go for that under the present or foreseeable circumstances, and they will fight and use their formidable power to defeat it, and that therefore it's not realizable as a practical matter. Well, I'm sorry to say. I wish it were, but it isn't. Sorry, Leila, go ahead.
I think there's something important I need to say, and I totally agree with Hussein over the fact that for the time being we don't have the political leadership adopting the one-state solution, and the Palestinian political debate so far has focused between the nationalists and the Islamists. But I do want to point out the fact that there is an important grassroots activism taking place for the time being within Palestine and also outside, which is campaigning precisely for the notion that Israel is today as an apartheid state, and we need to find it as such and call it accountable as such. And in that respect, I'm talking particularly about the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions sanctions that has been created 5 years ago and has been having incredible success. Now, of course, the BDS has not taken opposition whether we are fighting for a one state or two states. But if you look carefully at what the three principles of the BDS movement, it's calling for equal rights for all Palestinians and end of Israeli discrimination policy against the Palestinians inside Israel. It's calling to uphold the right of return, and it's calling to the end of Israeli occupation. This activism is going towards the direction is that we need to start to redefine the conflict.
Okay, Professor,
and hold Israel accountable. And the whole point, just one last point, is how we have to distinguish between also the old guards, which are now the generation which is negotiating, and the new guards that are thinking of alternatives. This doesn't mean that we are anytime soon close, but we need to start a discussion seriously, rather than, especially at the time is opportune.
Here's the important thing about BDS is that the actually effective sanctions that have taken hold and have really hurt and are going throughout Europe, etc., are targeted against the occupation. The ones that work are very specifically targeted against the occupation. The ones that target Israel generally have not been very successful. They've not been taken up, and that part of the movement kind of flounders. The occupation is vulnerable, very vulnerable to international pressure. It's very vulnerable to charges of apartheid. It's very vulnerable to all kinds of attacks. Israel as a state is not. Zionism as a concept is really not. There's not going to be a mass boycott among prominent American institutions of Israel as such. You can do it focused on the occupation. In Europe, we see it now. But I think the broader boycott movement is kind of a spectacular failure.
Hussein, earlier on you spoke about change.
It's a young movement.
One moment, Professor.
That's fair enough.
Right here.
Sorry.
Earlier on you spoke about change. You said settlements have been built, they can be brought down.
And they have been brought down.
Yeah, and walls are up and walls can be brought down as well. But let's look at the attitude from the Israeli side.
Yes.
Let's look at where they're going to. The Israeli Foreign Minister, Avigdor Lieberman, had some pretty harsh things to say to his Spanish and French counterparts, whom he met at a dinner in Jerusalem, and he said, and this is what he said, these were his words: solve your own problems in Europe before you come to us with complaints. Maybe then I will be open to accepting your suggestions. Israel will not be the Czechoslovakia of 2010.
Well, sure. Well, Lieberman is an embarrassment to Israel, and I think all the Israelis, left, right, and center, know it. Even Netanyahu has frozen him out of the debates entirely and repudiated the negotiations, rather, and repudiated his UN speech, and they very seldom let him out. They usually send Ayalon or Barak or somebody else like that because he's prone to making these outrageous statements that prompted an infuriated response from the Europeans. So, I mean, I think insofar as people like Netanyahu or Eli Yishai, the head of Shas, speaks for the Israelis, then it really would be fairly hopeless. With Netanyahu, you've got something a lot more ambiguous, and he's got to take into consideration not only the fact that there are other constituencies in Israel, but also the United States to contend with. And it's a major factor. By the way, on the question of settlements, we don't have to ask, can settlements be dismantled? We know they can. In Gaza and the northern West Bank, they were successfully. So the question is not can they be, the question is how many and when will they be? And I'm not saying they will. I'm not an optimist, okay, but I'm saying it's possible. We know it's possible. We don't need to debate if it's possible.
On the point of Avigdor Lieberman, he may be an embarrassment, as you point out, to the Israelis, but his constituency has the ear of the Prime Minister right now.
Well, not really. His constituency is,
well, I mean, there's
the
Prime Minister calling for an oath of loyalty.
Yeah,
he's
in that sense, yes, you're right. He has influence over the Prime Minister because his party, which might be described uncharitably as the Russian Tribal Party of Israel, or maybe the New Immigrants Party of Israel, if you wanted to be nicer, it has a lot of seats in the Knesset. So he has an undue influence over Netanyahu, and the Israeli political system, which is very poorly designed, it gives too much power to smaller parties, and you can see that Shas also has too much power, and yet that is not. He doesn't have. It's important to note, he has no role whatsoever in the negotiations. Israel has a very small team, all of them directly beholden to and reporting to Netanyahu and not Lieberman. And that's a significant fact.
Okay, let's
go. But Netanyahu is still not interested in a viable two-state solution.
That may well be true.
Is interested in an autonomy
that may well be true.
That is accepted by the Americans. That's the problem we are in.
Well, we have an email here. It came to us from Corina Robbins-Brownstein. Professor, I want to put this to you, and she writes, how many Muslim states are needed? There is only one homeland for the Jews.
Well, I don't think the debate is about a Muslim state or a Jewish state. I think what we're talking about is whether we can have a state that is of citizens in which all citizens are equal in that state. And that's, of course, a very tricky issue because of nationalism. I don't think the Palestinians want a Muslim state. They want their own independent state. The question is that Israel is not interested in giving them that state. And the challenge we're having today is, what are we going to do in this time, which is de facto being wasted? Are we just going to still keep on hoping that we're going to be given a state, which is actually a Bantustan, accepted internationally in this case? Or are we going to start to work seriously about how we're going to revive and recampaign on the one-state solution, especially that the PLO originally has adopted it in 1971 and has been on the Palestinian table until 1988. I think the strongest point for the one-state movement is the fact that the Palestinians tried the two-state solution, have made the historical compromise, has done everything that was expected of them for the past 20 years, since 1988, and still did not get a state. And I think that's the strong point. Now, the challenges are very significant, very significant, the challenges, both within the Palestinian camp and the Israeli camp, because, of course, the Israelis are completely against it. But I think the way you can campaign for it is to work on a local strategy, an Israeli strategy, and an international strategy, calling for a state for all of its citizens.
Okay, you're right. That is the strongest argument. But I want to say, right now, the majority of Palestinians do still want their own independent state. But I think you can see what waits in the wings. And it's not really a nonviolent, boycott-driven one-state movement. It's the Islamists who are likely to inherit. If the PLO strategy of negotiating with Israel fails, and the PA strategy of state-building fails, if they both fail, which they may well do, I think it's very unlikely there'll be any other outcome other than Islamists will inherit the movement. I think they're poised to do it, and I think it'll be very hard for any other movement to stop it. I hope it will not happen, because I think it'll be calamitous if it does, but that's where I see the tracks laid, and that's where I see the train going if it doesn't go down the two-state route. That's my view.
I don't see it so gloomy. I do think the Islamists has an important role to play, of course, but I also see that voices within the West Bank are becoming very challengers of that Islamist fundamental way. There is also within the Islamists, the Hamas has proven to be very prone to compromise and very willing to compromise and to deal. It's been ousted and been under siege, which doesn't help at all the situation.
I finally disagree with you. I finally disagree with you. I don't see Hamas as a great compromising force.
We're going to have to leave it there. Professor, thanks for joining us. Hussein, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for a great conversation, Leila.
We've run out of time.
Thank you. It was nice hearing you.
Thank you for being with us. A reminder that you can watch a podcast of the show on iTunes. This week we're featuring a discussion on deteriorating US-Pakistan relations and its impact on peace and stability in South Asia. Now, on the next show, struggles in Sudan. Actor and activist George Clooney tells us why a planned referendum in Africa's largest country next year could trigger more violence, suffering and death. Make sure you tune in for that. We'll see you next time.